Hello, my name is Mark Simos. I'm an architect with the cybersecurity practice at Microsoft, and I'm here with Tim Raines.
Hey Mark, my name is Tim Raines. I'm a Chief Security Advisor in Microsoft's Cybersecurity and Data Protection team.
And Tim, you work with customers a lot on various issues and helping them work through cloud trust, is that correct?
That's right. I've had the opportunity to talk to customers all over the world about cloud over the last 6-7 years. I've learned a lot from our conversations with CISOs and security professionals from different organizations, governments, enterprise customers, and so on all over the world. And I'm happy to be here to share some of the things I've learned from them on that journey.
Cool. And my role is a little bit more focused on helping customers with the hands-on piece of the cloud security, and helping them plan and identify what should be in the roadmap to address for cloud security, what comes first, and then helping through the nuts and bolts of actually securing it. So we'll be talking to you today about security in a cloud-enabled world, and that title is very deliberate. We're not talking about cloud security because as an isolated element, because the reality is that most enterprises, in our experience, are actually going to be in a hybrid mode of some sort where they have both on-premise assets as well as cloud assets for the foreseeable future. There will be some organizations that are purely on-premise, or some organizations that are fully in the cloud, but for the most part we expect that a large percentage of the folks that are working with our technology are going to have both. And so we want to really make sure we have a roadmap to help them with that. So, the way that we've structured this course, there's 8 total modules. We're going to do an introduction and overview and kind of cover the key areas of what we're going to be covering and all the key concepts that are guiding it. And then Tim's going to take our Microsoft role as a cloud provider and talk about that and what makes up a trustworthy cloud and what you should be looking for in a cloud provider and how Microsoft works to live up to that. And then we're going to switch over to the customer side, because it's really a shared responsibility when it comes down to it. And we're going to focus on what are the things that, what would I as a customer need to do to stay secure in this world? What are the things that I need to plan for and to prioritize and to focus on? Because there is so much that needs to be done, and we want to help our customers understand what we think they should be working on. Cool. So this first section, Introduction and Overview, we're going to cover the security context. We're going to cover the cloud context, because when you look at what's going on in the world today, the reality is that we have this uptrend in cybersecurity threats and the sophistication of these threats, but we also have the cloud capabilities coming online and all the things that they bring, not only to the IT world, but also to the IT security world. And so, we're then going to blend those two together into a single cloud security approach, and then we're going to go over the various modules and review what each of those are. So when we take a look at the different mega trends that are out there, which were well known and discussed quite a bit in the industry, mobile, social, cloud, and analytics. There's a fifth trend that's out there that isn't quite documented or acknowledged as a trend per se, but the cybersecurity threats are really increasing, and we're seeing a lot of sophistication. We're seeing a lot of volume increase in the cybersecurity threat landscape, and we see different sources of that, different motivations, different profiles, and different kinds of customers, consumers, enterprises that are being targeted in different ways. And so all of these things also interact with each other, and we're going to be spending most of the time here talking about where the cloud and then the cybersecurity pieces come together.
If I can add, Mark, many of the CISOs that I talk to around the world are grappling with these very topics that you've shown here on the slide. So mobile has obviously changed technology in the world forever, and that's not going away anytime soon. And so many organizations are trying to figure out how to grapple with a mobile strategy to enable their workers to access data anytime, anywhere, on any device, regardless of who the manufacturers of those devices are. So the whole bring your own device phenomena that we've seen, some of the organizations I've talked to have embraced that they're in it 100%, and then some of the organizations I've talked to say, no, we're only going to issue corporate-based assets. When it comes to, for instance, social networking, obviously that's changed the way people communicate around the world. Everyone is using their favorite social networks to communicate with other people, whether it's for business or as consumers. Yep. And so that's changed a lot of things. A lot of the CISOs I talk to around the world are grappling with a strategy that enables the business to use social networks, but in a way that prevents data leakage, or in a way that still enables them to protect data from leaking outside their organizations. You also talked a little bit about analytics, or AKA big data. Many organizations today are trying to figure out how do they monetize data that they actually have in their possession. So they've got lots of data on their customers, or they've got lots of data on products, services that they offer, and they're trying to figure out ways that they can actually drive business forward using insights from that data. One of the things that the CISOs and the privacy officers of these companies are trying to figure out is how do they do that in a way that protects the data and also, observes the privacy laws of different countries around the world, and making sure that the data is protected in a way that enables them to continue to use it, but also in a way that honors the privacy expectations of their customers, partners, shareholders, and so on. So, these trends that you're talking about are important to drive business forward, and as you mentioned, it expands the attack surface area in some ways, and that's what the CISOs that I talk to are really concerned about, is how do we enable the business to use all these big mega trends in technology, but how do we actually have a security strategy that holistically helps us manage data that's being shared across all of those scenarios, devices, anytime, anywhere around the world. And this is why cloud is central to this, is that in each one of those cases, whether it's mobile, whether it's social networking, whether it's big data and so on, the cloud is the central point of all of that enables that to work. The authentication, the authorization, storage of data, it's all in the cloud.
Yep, I completely agree.
The other thing that wasn't on the slide that should be is Internet of Things. And so if you imagine 4 or 5 years from now, a world where you have not just 3 or 4 or 5 manufacturers of different handsets, and we're talking about smartphones and this type of thing, we're talking about thousands of manufacturers of millions and millions of devices that once deployed out into the real world, there's going to be billions or even trillions of internet-connected devices that aren't running necessarily full operating systems the way that devices are today. And so what does that look like? How do we protect those devices and the data that those devices are collecting and send?
Or protect ourselves from those devices.
And again, I think the cloud is central to all that. And that's why you and I are here today to talk about the cloud, because it is central to all of these mega trends that you've talked about.
Very much so. And security is just a part of our world. There's so many different aspects of it that come into play. I mean, and the nice thing is, on the silver lining side of these, is that we're also starting to see some products and offerings and capabilities that leverage cloud services and the inherent nature of them, as well as the analytics and the big data technology and approaches to increase security. And so we're seeing some of those things actually being used to help security, not just create new risks that have to be managed. And so it's very much a mixed bag from what we're seeing. And so when we look at kind of these two specific trends, the cybersecurity and the cloud, and how those two come together, there's really two different things that result from it. The first is a couple of imperatives. We really have to increase the security rigor at all layers, because the cybersecurity threat is bringing so much visibility into the potential vulnerabilities at all layers. When you look at the ability of an attacker to exploit user behaviors and practices and habits and the like. They can exploit an application. They can exploit a middleware such as Java or .NET if there's a vulnerability in those. They can exploit an operating system such as Windows or Linux. They can exploit the firmware on a motherboard or UEFI. We're starting to see that, or even flaws in some of the CPUs. So the amount of opportunity and attack surface that the attackers have really are forcing us to look at all layers of security at once, and they have a menu to choose from, and we have to secure the whole thing, it's a significant challenge. And the way that the cloud contributes is that it allows us to start shifting the primary defenses and the security threats as well from primarily a network-centric approach, which has been the classic IT security model, which is, put a firewall in, restrict ports and protocols, kind of the classic approach. And we need to get to the point where we're protecting the identities, we're protecting the applications, we're moving towards those business-aligned areas and making sure we're protecting from those business assets and that business value, and then making sure those security controls protect against it.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Mark. One of the things that I've noticed the customers that start to evaluate cloud services and start to dip their toe in the cloud, if you will, is that the old way of doing things with firewalls, VPNs, direct access, getting all of their information workers that are remote to connect their network back into the data center or the corporate headquarters, that's a really kind of old-fashioned IT scenario these days. And I see many customers are still running it, and I mean, that's perfectly fine because it's working for them. But one thing to realize when you move to the cloud is you enable business scenarios that weren't possible on-premise using VPNs and forcing people to connect back into a corporate data center. So you'll see this as we talk through this, but really having, for instance, identity in the cloud. Identity is the cornerstone of security. And so having identity, true identity in the cloud enables scenarios that you could only dream of on-premise. RMS today is a reality across devices. So it doesn't matter who manufactures the device, the operating system, and so on. I can send you now an email from my Windows phone. You can pick it up on your iPhone or your Android device, and all of those restrictions will be honored on those devices. That's only made possible by having identity in the cloud. And so I'm really, really excited about this change. And for most IT professionals or CISOs or security professionals out there that are now just starting to learn about the cloud and really what it's about, you're a security professional, so take a look at it from a security point of view, and I think you'll see that having these capabilities in the cloud is an extremely positive thing because it changes the paradigm. You no longer have to force people to go back into your infrastructure. So access to any information anywhere in the world on any device is literally possible today because of the cloud.
Yep, and it kind of reflects. I see two reasons for sort of the effectiveness of the traditional perimeter approach going away. The first is what you mentioned, which is all the value you get by having the cloud services. But the second is that, quite frankly, the adversaries have gotten so good at getting inside the network perimeter by phishing users, drive-by attacks, watering hole attacks. There's many different ways to get a user to click on something or to get them to browse to a location and essentially get a foothold into a customer network. And we just really have to acknowledge that reality that the perimeter does have use and it does have some value, but it's no longer something you can bet the security of your company on. You have to understand it's been diminished significantly, and you have to look at the identities, you have to look at where the assets are, protecting the assets where they are, applying encryption with policy, which is what RMS does, not just blindly applying encryption, because encryption takes a big problem that's variable sized, which is data, and turns it into a small problem, which is fixed size, which is a key. If you get that key, you have access to the data. And so you have to really start looking at things differently than those traditional inside versus outside. We just don't have that castle anymore. And the other thing that comes along that is really nice is there's some opportunities as these come together. When you get to a point where you have a trusted cloud provider, a cloud provider that you deem that's trustworthy, that, you know what, these guys, I trust them to host my business data on their cloud services, then you have the ability to transfer some of that operational and security risk, that huge stack of protecting that whole stack all the way from the users to the apps to the data, all the way down to the firmware and to the hardware. You can move some of that responsibility to a cloud service provider, which is an excellent opportunity because it allows you to focus on the business aligned pieces. And there's a lot of other capabilities from the Microsoft Cloud and from other vendors as well that allow you to do things much like RMS that really embrace these new features that wouldn't be available otherwise. So definitely a mix of good and bad as we enter into this new world. And so the next piece is just a kind of a rhetorical question we'd like you guys to kind of think about and ask yourselves, which is, why would an adversary attack your cloud service tenants? Would it be for intellectual property theft, espionage, currency theft, maybe to obtain PHI or PII to personally identifiable information or personal health information to be able to either use, or abuse, or to sell on the black market? And of course, the answer is all of them. Cloud assets, on-premise assets, it's really about the data and protecting the data. And we really have to start thinking about that and not so much about the specific instances and whether it's a cloud service or an on-premise service. So one of the key things to understand as we get into this world is that ultimately when you talk about adopting a cloud service, ultimately you're entering into a partnership, and you have a set of shared responsibilities between the cloud service provider and between the tenants, the customers that are using the service. And it's very key to understand this, because IT really hasn't had a lot of history in most cases with partnerships, with successful outsourcing. There's been some organizations that have outsourced their entire IT department or maybe the running of a data center, but for the most part those were pretty static. And there wasn't this dynamic partnership where the cloud service provider or the service provider was releasing features on a regular basis and moving things forward. It was pretty much a static SLA that held there for years. So this is kind of a new thing for IT to be digesting, is having an active partner that is actively working on both the security side and the operational side and the capability side. And so that's a little bit new to the IT world, whereas some of the other departments within a business, such as manufacturing and the others, they have a little bit more experience with it. But this is pretty new to IT in our experience. And so within this partnership, there's kind of some core security elements. The first, in the case of the Microsoft Cloud, the Microsoft Cloud is built on a foundation of trust and security, and Tim's going to cover a lot of that in Module 2. And it's all about providing that service in a very trustworthy way. And then there's those additional features that we were mentioning a little bit earlier, such as Azure RMS, Azure Key Vault, and some of the others that allow you to then take those security services and use that to secure your data and secure your assets and applications. And so that's the Microsoft piece of it, as a trustworthy foundation, and then the security services on top of it. And then secondly, on kind of the tenant or the customer side, is you really own your data. You own your data, your identities, and the responsibility for protecting them. And it's about everything that you control, you have to protect. And so as you move things to the cloud service provider and they operate it on your behalf, you don't have to worry about securing it except for the controls that they give you, except for the specific options and configuration choices that they give you. And so it's really, you pretty much have to secure everything you control is the way we look at it.
Well, to add to that, I mean, I've talked to a lot of IT pros around the world, and their visceral reaction really to the cloud for the first time is, geez, this is going to reduce what we're doing on premise, and is there going to be job losses? And that's not what the cloud does at all, actually. What the cloud allows you to do is transfer some of the responsibility for some of the things that you've been doing on premise to your cloud service provider, and that's going to free up some of your time to do other things that are more strategic, and frankly, from a security perspective, are going to allow you to focus on things a little bit more than you have been in the past, because most IT shops and security professionals have been spread thin for so long. So the cloud doesn't change, doesn't change the scope of your job. The cloud changes the focus that you're actually able to have, and many companies, when they get into the cloud and they start loading a lot of the day in and day out admin responsibilities for services to the cloud service provider, that enables the people working on premise on IT, which doesn't go away at all, because you have to access the cloud from assets that you're still managing on premise. allows them to focus on those assets, allows them to focus on a more holistic security strategy that they haven't had time to get to. So this is for many companies, once they get into this, it is a positive change. It enables the people working in the IT shop on premise to actually get to more strategic things, to essentially delegate the day in and day out administration of IT and get into things, again, that are more strategic and more focused.
Yeah, you can get to the information protection program that you've always wanted to do, but you could never quite get the budget and the people freed up to do. You can get to all those things that you just haven't had a chance to get to. And so there's a real opportunity here. And it does require a mindset shift, though, and you have to kind of flip a bit that the traditional approach to security has always been the more control, the better. I want control because that makes me able to secure something. But once you have a trustworthy partner, a trustworthy cloud service provider that you can transfer things off to, you want to have less control. You want to give as much to them as you possibly can because you're already trusting them, and they already have that need for you to trust them. Once you pass that, you want to put as much as you can on them so that you can get those business-aligned projects, those things that bring real value to the business and real recognition to IT and IT security. You want to get those things off the ground, and that's where the opportunity to shine really comes in. So when we take a look at the breakdown of this, the responsibility does break down the way the partnership breaks down a little bit differently on a per service basis. And so what I'm going to have you guys look at is those top 3 lines first, because there's a certain set of things that unless you opt into a managed service or you have something contracted out that they're going to secure your device endpoints or do your IT administration for you, there's certain things that you always will own. And so your data and the rights to it and the access management to it, all of that is always going to be yours. That's always going to be something that's under your control. And the cloud will simply provide you controls to control that. The client endpoints that are used to access it and the security of those is also something that is absolutely yours, and unless you opt into it, a managed service, the cloud provider is really only providing controls to help you with that. And then account and access management, your identities and the users and the access that they have to the various different assets. Those top 3 are always something that are under your control and responsibility. Then skipping down to those bottom 3, because the top 3 you just can't snap your fingers and go to the cloud and it's magically taken care of. You always have to handle those. The bottom 3 aren't quite a snap your fingers because you do have to go through a migration process. But by going to the cloud, you get out of the operational responsibility and security responsibility of having to operate a physical data center and the physical networks and the physical host and the physical access to it, and all of that from both the operational and security perspective. And so there's a huge opportunity just by going to any cloud variant, whether it's software as a service, platform as a service, or infrastructure as a service. You get that opportunity to transfer that responsibility wholesale to the cloud provider, and you don't have to worry about that for that workload anymore.
Yeah, this slide that you've shown here is like CIOs that I talk to around the world, they love this slide because it breaks down in a very precise way roles and responsibilities when you move into infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. And that's not obvious to people because we talk about the cloud as if it's one thing, but it's really different flavors of deployment, right? So most of the people that I talk to, they either go into, for instance, Office 365, which is software as a service, or they'll go into Azure IaaS, by moving some of their infrastructure into virtual machines inside of Azure. And those are, dramatically different things. The roles and responsibilities are quite different. And so, a lot of the initial conversations we have with customers about cloud, it all focuses on the data center. And of course, cloud service providers that want your business have to prove that they're meeting your own internal standards, prove that they're meeting industry standards that you might care about in your organization. And they have to prove that the cloud service provider is worthy of your trust. But the one thing, once you get past that, once you start to show like kind of behind the curtain, this is how things in the data center are being managed, then we can get back to where most of the attacks that we see actually happen, right? I always call the client the forgotten part of the cloud, okay? Because most of these attacks, the phishing attacks, the drive-by download attacks, the attacks that we talk about in the Microsoft Security Intelligence Report that we've published now for almost 10 years, vast majority of those attacks happen on the client. And so by moving some of the day-to-day operations from your data center into a cloud service provider's data center, and then allowing you to focus more on that holistic security strategy, for a lot of the customers I talk to around the world, once they do that, it's liberating because, as you mentioned, they can finally get to some of the security programs that they always wanted to, but never had the time to get to.
Yep. And when I talk with customers about, looking at SaaS versus PaaS versus IaaS, ultimately, SaaS, even from a security perspective, is a favorite because you know what? It's something that's built. It's exactly what you need. And something like Office 365 or Dynamics. Now, Office 365 is pretty low configuration. Dynamics is pretty high configuration because you have to input your business processes. But ultimately, in the SaaS world, the code's written, it's running, it's operating. All you have to do is subscribe to a tenant to it, and you're done. You're up and running. And so the SaaS piece is great because you have a very limited set of control. Again, that new mindset of less control is better. And it's baked, it's done, it's secure, and you don't have to worry about it. And now PaaS is sort of the next best. Is hey, I need to do a little bit of logic. I need to write a bit of code because our website or our order processing system or line of business app or whatever it happens to be. We have a need for something custom that just isn't there in the marketplace. And so PaaS is sort of the next best. You do have to secure the code because it is a custom set of logic. You have to make sure that it follows all of the design principles like are ensconced in the SDL. And it's the next best thing. And then the IaaS is sort of the fallback. If you can't put something on a PaaS and just have Microsoft run the VMs and the web and worker roles, you can put a full VM that you control. The challenge with IaaS is that you have to secure an entire OS stack, the management of it, the middleware, all of the things that have to be installed on it. And so you take on a lot more security burden in IaaS. You don't have the physical data center piece, but you do have to secure that full OS stack. And so we tend to prefer the least responsibility. SaaS is the ideal case, PaaS is the fallback, and then IaaS is the ultimate fallback from a cloud perspective. That's usually what we work with our customers on prioritizing. And just one quick point here is that the attacks ultimately are targeting the data, as I think we've discussed already. And the challenge is, of course, that if the attacker gets at a place that's lower than where the data is, then they can get it. So you have to keep the whole stack secure just to keep that data secure. So that is one of the biggest challenges we see. So as we step into the security context here, we've seen an interesting evolution in the cyber threat world. If you look at what governments have been doing for the longest time, they've been spying on each other ever since there was a chief of one tribe and a chief of another tribe because they wanted to know what the neighboring tribe was doing and thinking. So the fact that we're seeing espionage and cyber war and all this traditional government activities happening in the electronic space is really not that surprising. It's just a natural evolution of things. The thing that's been interesting that we've seen with the cyber threats is we've seen an evolution where individual organizations and individual people are targeted using the internet and these various pieces. And so that's one of the things that's been sort of an interesting change that isn't kind of linear from directly from history. The typical motivations we see for a cyber attack are competition, economic development, just pure economic reasons, whether it's that are more long-term as opposed to a direct profit. We do see a lot of immediate profit, such as stealing credit card information, PHI information that's going to be resold on the black market. We see both that immediate profit as well as sort of that long-term economic benefit as well, sort of the short-term, long-term piece. And then we also see some of the attacks that are driven by more of a message where a group has a particular position to take and they want to get that particular message out, whether it's a moral message, whether it's an economic message, whether it's a patriotic national message. We've seen different variants of that. And those are the kind of typical motivations that we see in the marketplace. Yeah,
this actually is pretty key. Part of the challenge of cybersecurity is that attribution to who's attacking you. is super, super hard, because all of the data coming across and attacks coming across the network look the same, regardless of who's doing it. And that's what makes cybersecurity and cybersecurity strategy so challenging for so many organizations, because they can't tell who's attacking them. They can't tell the motivation of the attackers, because if they could do that, then understanding what a response would be to that type of attack and who should have been involved in helping them with the response would be far clearer. So if it's a nation-state attack, does a proper response involve law enforcement or the government, of where the organization is located? If it's an attack where theft and criminal activity is really the motivation, so it's all about crime. Again, does law enforcement get involved? Is it an industry issue? Who should be involved in that response? If it's hacktivism and people are attacking you because they don't like your business or your organization, who should be involved in that response? So this is pretty key to security strategy. Is a lot of organizations I talk to struggle with attribution, who's attacking them, what's motivating them. And since the internet doesn't give us any clues to that, all the packets look the same on the wire, that's a really, really difficult thing, and something that makes defending and responding to attacks much more challenging than if we had that information.
I agree completely. And there was an interesting Black Hat talk that I attended the past couple of years that was talking about applying military doctrine to security and military thinking to security operations, IT security operations. And one of the interesting statements that they made is that if you can attribute who is attacking you, that means the attacker has made an operational security failure. They have failed in hiding their origin, because it's pretty much a default motivation that they're going to want to hide where they're coming from, or the attack itself, or the methods they're going to use, or the timing of it. They're going to want to keep some of that hidden so that you can't be prepared for it. So it's a very natural thing for them to hide a lot of aspects, if not all aspects, of the attack until after it's over with. And so if you can figure out who they are, it's generally a failure on their part to hide it. And so it was an interesting perspective that really had me look at things differently. And so the interesting thing that we've seen, I'm sure for folks that are watching this, you've seen a lot of the headlines that come across, and there's all sorts of different very high-profile attacks, which we don't have to repeat all the names for. But we're starting to see, and this is just a smattering of some different ones, we're seeing a lot of interesting smaller targets that are being hit. We're seeing different organizations that have a very narrow market share or a very specialized set of knowledge that isn't sort of an obvious large target that someone may think of right offhand. And we're seeing all sorts of interesting attacks on different organizations, and finding different ways of monetizing information, gaining a competitive advantage. And the variety that we see in terms of industries targeted, customers targeted, sizes, it constantly amazes me. I'm always seeing a new angle on someone attacking for a reason that I would have never thought of on my own. And so the impacts that customers can see, and that it can impact the organization, your ability to compete is degraded, reputation, destruction, corruption of data, or potentially ransoming of data, being used as a relay. Law firms are frequently targeted because of the confidential information of their clients. We saw that RSA attack of probably 4 or 5 years ago now, that they were targeted because their devices were used by customers that the attackers wanted to get to. So we see organizations targeted as a relay frequently. Service interruption, sometimes attackers want to take down a service and harm an organization. A little bit on the rare side. They mostly want to make money as opposed to make someone else lose money. And of course, all of this results in potential legal liability to the organization. So we see a lot of different sort of realization of this risk, kind of coming home.
Yeah, some of the large customers that I talk to that have mature security programs and lots of resources, one of the things that they've been looking at now for several years is supply chain, which is ultimately what you're talking about, and what types of security standards they have to push down into their supply chain with their suppliers, their partners, and so on. because the weakest link in the chain is often the one being targeted in order to get access to their environment, and then they have, they're a trusted partner to the actual target of the attack. And so supply chain is something that, again, some of the more mature security programs out there are looking at, and they're looking at standards around secure development. They're looking at standards around operational security to ensure that their partners maintain a particular standard so that if they are attacked, it makes it easier to defend, it makes it easier to detect the attack, and it also makes it easier for them to still protect the data.
Yep. Very key. And when we take a look at sort of the huge trends, kind of trying to sum it up, is when we look at cyber attacks versus any other way of getting this information or getting this economic advantage, the ROI, the return on investment for the adversary is just astronomical. It's amazing how effective they can be for the level of investment they have to put in using these cyber attacks, and that's a huge thing that we're seeing. So we do not expect the level of attacks to go away. In fact, we expect them to likely increase as more and more organizations kind of enter into these types of activities. Adversary maturity. We're not seeing, the kind of the geek in the basement. Like you said, sometimes it's nation state, sometimes it's a criminal organization, but we see specialization. We see teams that get in and they hand off the access to somebody else that knows what data to go after. We see a lot of specialization, and quite frankly, the black markets are incredibly mature. We've even seen instances where a piece of malware had a replacement guarantee. If this gets detected by anti-malware software or antivirus software, we'll go ahead and replace it for free. So we're seeing very, very mature business models on the black market side of things that are quite eye-opening. And then the other piece that's really kind of dominant is the use of legitimate credentials and the theft of them, the abuse of them, impersonating legitimate accounts. We're seeing a huge amount of attacks in this space, and like you said earlier, with the identity space, that's a huge target area for the attackers, because once you're in and you're authenticated as a legitimate user, then you have the ability to do anything that user can do. You can steal the credentials, you can attack other systems, you can download data, you can modify data, you can delete data. You have a lot of different options if you're that legitimate person. And so that's something that we're seeing a lot of heavy focus on by the attackers, both on premise and in the cloud.
I would add that there's a couple of nuances, important nuances in this conversation that we have with customers, and that's one of them is it goes back to motivation and who's attacking you and why. And so you have a world where you have lots and lots of commodity malware, and that's why you run antivirus and security programs within your infrastructure to protect you from the millions and millions of malware threats that are out there being created all the time. So attackers are using large-scale automation to create malware constantly. And so it's really important to run up-to-date antivirus software from a trusted source. But oftentimes I'll run into security experts that say that antivirus software is worthless because it doesn't protect them from the so-called advanced persistent threat. And this is where we start to split hairs and get into a nuance, because the folks that are persistent, and I wouldn't say they're any more advanced, the state of the art has been the state of the art for a long time. There are always exceptions, but they're running their malware that they're creating through all of the different commercial antivirus products on the market to make sure it's not getting detected by antivirus. That's custom malware that they're going to use in a very targeted attack. Don't confuse the two, because they're very different things.
Yes.
And again, it goes back to who's attacking you, their motivation and attribution, and why that matters in this equation. Yeah. And so oftentimes people will treat the nuance that I'm trying to articulate here, oftentimes they'll treat them like they're the same thing. It's all one category, and it really isn't. You've got a lot of different people out there. Some of them, as you mentioned, are focused on economic espionage, military espionage, hacktivism, crime, notoriety. There's all sorts of motivations. So if you treat them with a broad brush and treat them all the same, your security strategy is not going to be holistic enough to protect you from all those threats. So it's tempting to treat all of these the same way, and they're not. The good news is that they're not really advanced, right? These threats that we're seeing are not advanced. They're a variation on a theme that we've seen for many, many years. Most of the big profile attacks that you've read about in the paper or seen in the news have phishing involved, have unpatched vulnerabilities in their environments that are known vulnerabilities. The number of 0 days that we see are very, very small. And so doing the basics, doing basic hygiene actually does have immense benefit. So most of the attacks that we've seen are taking advantage of environments that have unpatched vulnerabilities that are publicly known. So keeping up to date on your software, running up to date antivirus software from a trusted vendor. Just basic hygiene is going to pay dividends, huge dividends. So the good news is this is doable. You can do this.
Absolutely agree, because there's two benefits depending on the type of attacker. If you're a target of opportunity and your neighbor is just as good of a house to rob as yours is, well, you've increased the cost and they're more likely to rob your neighbor by doing those basic hygienes and raising the cost of the attacker. And then secondly, if you do have an advanced attacker, you've raised the cost of their attack so that they have to spend the money to either research and find a 0 day, or they have to go through the effort of, or go through the cost rather, of buying one if they can't generate their own.
In a nutshell, that's a big part of Microsoft's security strategy, is increasing the cost and time that it takes to find vulnerabilities in our software and services,
Yep.
And then making it super, super hard, if not impossible, to exploit vulnerabilities that are found. And so that raises the cost of exploitation to attackers, and it decreases the ROI. And so, earlier when you talked about ROI, that's why this is so key, is if you can decrease the ROI by making it super hard to find vulnerabilities and super hard to exploit vulnerabilities, and if they can exploit vulnerabilities, make it really unpredictable when they're exploitable, make it really, inconsistent, it makes it harder for them to do what they're doing. And then it makes it easier for the layers of mitigations that you put in place to work the way they were designed to work.
Yep. Cool. And so one of the principles that guides a lot of the work that we do is something that's called assume breach. And what this is really a design philosophy that you adopt as you're designing security controls in your environment. This does not mean that you're not going to try and prevent breach, and I'll go ahead and animate the rest of the slide there real quick. Ultimately, prevent breach has been around forever. People have always wanted to keep the bad guys out of their network. They've always wanted to protect their environment and keep them out. But the reality is that some of them can and will get through, and you have to have the environment set up in such a way that knocking over one pawn will not get you the king automatically. And so the idea of the assume breach is to make sure that you're designing all of the controls in your environment such that you're assuming any given node could be lost, and you want to minimize the impact of any of those on the rest of the environments, the rest of the assets in the environment, particularly the high-value assets. You don't want to have one secretary clicking on the wrong thing, leading to your proprietary formula that's an unpatented trade secret going out the door. And so you really want to design your environment to assume that any given piece could be lost at any moment, and how do you defend against that? And so that's a huge part of how we plan defenses, both for on-premise and for the cloud.
Yeah, we've been talking about that, the cliche at this point of a hard outer shell and the soft GUI center, right? So you create this hard outer shell, you spend all of this time and effort on firewalls and perimeter defense, and when that gets breached, it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when, because we're dealing with determined adversaries. They get into the soft GUI center, and so few organizations have spent time investing in detection. So how would we know if we got breached? And in making it hard for the bad guys to move around the environment once they get in. And so this is why we've put so much time and effort now into the assume breach philosophy here, because if you assume that you'll be breached, you give yourself permission to think about, how would I know if I got breached, and how would I make it harder for the bad guys to move around and get to higher value assets. And if you put some time and thought into that and assume that you'll be breached, you really do give yourself permission, and it's liberating. If we're going to get breached, what do we do next? How do we know when we're breached, and how do we make it hard for them to move around? So you can actually have a more holistic security strategy than just, perimeter defense.
Exactly. So we're going to spend a little bit of time kind of going over the cloud context and the way that we're seeing our customers adopt the cloud, and kind of how those pieces are playing into the security of the cloud-enabled world. And so the simplest is SaaS adoption, adopting Office 365 or Microsoft Dynamics for another SaaS application that's pretty well ready to go. And it just needs some level of configuration, but otherwise it's up and running, doesn't require any coding or installing or anything like that. The other scenarios that we see frequently is for development. So whether you're putting one application in Azure, or you're adopting Azure as your standard platform for all of the applications that you're developing, and then this is our new standard way of deploying them. We see a lot of development being as a key scenario. And then the infrastructure is the other one that we see a lot of. And so, whether we see someone adding a data center or a virtual data center and saying, either Azure is my 5th or 3rd or 7th data center, and we're going to start putting stuff in there because we're out of rack space, or we don't want to spend any more money to build a new data center and break ground on it. And then we do see some organizations where that are purely in the cloud. And so Azure is their only data center, and their apps are out there. But that tends to be a minority, unless it's a startup organization that doesn't have legacy of a physical data center and a physical presence already. But for the most part, we see a lot more of the adding multiple data centers within Azure is typically what we see there, as well as the SaaS piece is a pretty heavy piece in the development. And so as you look at each individual workload, we see a couple different scenarios as far as how do I get a workload in the cloud. Well, the first is very simple. So you subscribe to a SaaS application. And so the SaaS application is there. Many or all of the Microsoft ones tie into the Azure Active Directory. So you have that single sign-on and that single identity and that single point for monitoring. And there's a lot of things that tie into Azure, but typically the SaaS application itself stands alone, even if the directory it uses is Azure. So that's one way of going to the cloud. Rewriting an existing application, preferably to PaaS, sometimes to IaaS, but that's another way to get a workload in the cloud, but that does take a decent amount of effort and cost to actually do it. And then we'll also be talking about a third scenario, which is a very common one that we're seeing, which the industry term is lift and shift, which is we're going to take our existing applications, whether they're on virtual machines or whether they're on a physical server now, migrate those to Azure Infrastructure as a Service, and just pretty much take them as is and run them as is, so that we don't have to do a lot of modifications to it. So those are the main scenarios that we see when we see customers taking a workload to the cloud, is either adopting something that's there, writing something new for it, or porting an existing one, or simply taking it as is and just doing that lift and shift operation to the Infrastructure as a Service. And so we'll be referring to those scenarios as we go. And these are more for reference, and you guys will have access to the slides as well. Software as a service, I think we've covered pretty well. Platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, and then private cloud. And private cloud is really when you run a private data center in a way that has the cloud attributes of the cloud principle of the flexibility and the dynamic expansion of resources and the like. But ultimately, a private cloud is run by your organization, so you adopt that whole stack and that whole responsibility for securing that stack. And there are a couple of interesting hybrid scenarios that we do see as well. For example, an organization can write an application to a PaaS platform like Azure, and then sell that application and the services to other customers. And so they sell access to the application as a SaaS, or alternately running the platform on an IaaS and then selling that application out as a SaaS application. So sometimes we do see that, and you have to kind of think about the security in each individual layer specifically. And then there's also the potential for hybrid, and quite frankly, the imagination is the limit here in terms of what kind of applications can interact with each other and apply analytics, using old components, legacy components that are either on-premise or lifted and shifted to the cloud, some new components and paths to enhance it. We've seen a lot of variety in this space, and so when we look at these spaces through a security lens, it's ultimately about securing each of those, because each interaction has to be looked at individually. And if you have a common identity, common directory, it does simplify it somewhat. But you really have to look at each of those components and make sure you're thinking about each of them and looking at the security individually, because it's going to be a little bit different for each component. And these are just some of the stories that we've actually seen. A couple of them my team has responded to and helped our customers with these particular attacks, and a couple of them are the bottom ones, the cloud drive-by attacks, are actually from an Azure post, which is has a link on the slide there. We've seen weak password policy, which we'll cover in the user and device section. That an organization that had a very weak password policy was, I think, 5 or 6 characters minimum and no complexity. And they went to the cloud. Well, they exposed that password policy through ADFS to anyone on the internet that could try and do password guessing and brute forcing attacks. And so we've seen some of the old attacks come back. We actually saw the attackers using that brute force techniques. We've seen, and this was not on our platform, but we've seen a cloud service tenant that was completely wiped, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the administrative control section. But ultimately, we've seen an organization been put out of business because of an attack on their cloud assets, and they happen to be a cloud-only organization. So, you know, that it underscores the importance of keeping control, and that's why one of the very first steps in the customer roadmap, the second step actually, is administrative control, because it is so critical to the security of that cloud service. And then we've seen various different types of misconfigurations or oversights or weak passwords that or lack of scanning, which are detailed out in that Azure blog. We've seen all sorts of different misconfigurations or oversights being exploited by attackers because these services are available out on the internet and they're fairly easy to discover. And so we've seen the attackers take advantage of that. And so that rigor and discipline becomes super critical because of the exposure level. So that's something that we've seen quite a bit of. So we've pretty much covered this. Any other comments that you wanted to add to this? Or?
I will touch on this in the next module. It is a super important slide, and as I mentioned, the CIOs that I talk to, this is their favorite slide. So I'll spend a little bit of time on that in the next module. Okay. But take a look at it, because it really does help lay out what you're getting for your money from a security perspective in IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS.
Yep. And so when we take a look at this, and one thing I want to switch over really quick to all of this content that we're describing is actually, if you look on the screen there, is actually part of and covered in a security poster. It's in Visio and PDF format, and we have the link to it a little bit later. It's aka.ms/secure customer, and it covers all the content. It's basically the outline that we're following for this particular MVA session, and it talks about the trust. It talks about the different service types. And then it gets into the that same chart, as well as these keys to success. And I wanted to take a moment here. There we go. And go back. And just highlight some of these keys, because really these keys to success are very important in kind of driving as driving themes of how we advise our customers to plan, because the governance and security policy, when everything was on the same network and that kind of old castle mentality, and everything was in the castle walls, whether it was on a workstation or whether it was on a server, the security profile was roughly the same in that world. But with the mobile devices, as you were mentioning earlier, with the cloud services of the various different pedigrees and different levels of IT visibility and security standards being applied to them, and all of these different factors in the modern world, the governance the ability to capture the intent of the organization of where should this type of data be allowed to go. Should it be allowed to go on any mobile device? Should it be allowed to only go on a compliant mobile device? There's a lot of intent that really needs to be expressed because the users have so much more choice in this world, or the ability to express a choice whether or not it's against policy. And without that policy to guide them and tell them, hey, this is what the organization wants you to do with the data, it's really hard to measure against that. It's really hard for those users to make good decisions. And so governance and policy is just a really critical piece that it's always been important, but it's become so much more important in this cloud world. And then admin rights, you lose admin control of your tenant, and you've lost the ability to control pretty much everything in that tenant in most cases, and it's a very dangerous thing. So you have to look at those administrative rights in a very different way than you would any other user account. And as you mentioned earlier, Tim, identity is so key to security. And you can't even form a sentence about security without using an identity. And the subject or the object of the sentence has to be an identity. If I want to say, I don't want this user to access these resources, I only want to let these users into my network, you have to have an identity in there. And so the integrity of that identity is so critical to security, and you've got to keep that identity under control. Otherwise, your security assurances are going to be undermined very significantly. And of course, threat awareness. What I would face as a small shop that's baking cupcakes is very different than an oil company would face, is different than what a government organization would face, is different than any other industry. And so the specific types of attacks, the things that they would target, and the various pieces that they're going to go after, you have to be very aware of yourself internally as an organization and what is valuable, as well as what organizations would target me for what reasons. And so that context is very, very important.
I think that's really key, because this is another reason why the cloud doesn't actually reduce the number of security jobs in an organization when the organization embraces cloud. No one knows the risk to that organization like that organization does. So most of the customers I talk to around the world, we talk about specific risks, but whether that's really a risk to that customer in that industry and that geography that they care about, because there's lots of risks, but are they a priority for that organization? No one knows that better than that organization. And so the people in that organization doing security for that organization, just because the organization starts using cloud computing, IaaS or SaaS or something, that does not diminish the requirement of having security expertise and granular understanding of that business and the threats to that business that they actually care about at all. It actually increases them. Your expertise around risk and risk management for your organization, in your industry, in your location, is gold. And the cloud, again, offloads some of the day-to-day administration and operational stuff and will free your time up to do more of the risk management that's actually more strategic and probably more important to the organization at this point in time.
Yep. And then the last piece that I want to call out here is just data protection. It is all about the data. There are a few instances we see, and they tend to get a pretty good amount of press when they do, where an attacker is out to do a revenge hack or to destroy data or to incapacitate an organization. We do see those attacks on occasion. They do get a lot of press proportionally versus the data theft ones. But in throwing an arbitrary number out there, 99% of the cases that we investigate and that we're aware of and that we see, it's all about the data. The adversaries are trying to get a piece of data, whether it's a proprietary design, whether it's saleable PII, PHI that they can resell on the black market, whether it's competitive intelligence on what companies an organization may be purchasing, what policy is going to be coming out that hasn't been released yet, what product hasn't been released yet. It really is all about the data, and you have to think in terms of the data. The caveat is, of course, if you don't have the stack secure and you don't have the apps and the OS and all those pieces secure, you can't secure the data. But you really have to have that data focus, and it's really about the data. And again, as a cloud service provider, our position is always that you own your data, and we're going to do everything we can to help you protect it. But ultimately, that is the number one responsibility. So the way that we frame our thinking, as I was showing earlier, we do have this cloud security poster that outlines all of these concepts that we're talking about in this course, and does have that customer responsibility roadmap that has each of those 8 components, which we'll cover in a couple of slides. And we are heavily influenced by the NIST cybersecurity approach and the NIST cybersecurity framework. And this is a really great guide for operationalizing security for your organization and turning it from a static prevent breach approach to more of a operationalized assume breach approach, where you have a response plan if there's an incident, and you know what to do, who to call, who to notify, who to bring in, and then of course remediation actions. And the more that you prepare for this ahead of time, the better prepared you are in the event of an incident. And so that does heavily influence our thinking, and that's a big part of what's gone into this. And so these are just a couple of resources: Determine Adversaries and Targeted Attacks. It's a great insight into the mindset of the attackers and the fact that they're after the data and they don't really care what methods they're going to use. The Security Intelligence Report, as you mentioned earlier, is a phenomenal resource for seeing what we see on our telemetry and our sensor networks, and being able to get a perspective of that. For the credential theft pieces, there is a dedicated portal for that to get you information on that, videos, white papers that really help explain this main way that we're seeing adversaries exploit identities and really leverage those. And then there's also the assume breach approach, and so there's a great blog that was put out there that describes the philosophy and how to apply the assume breach and how we're baking it into a couple of our products in the I can't remember if it was Windows Server System Center for this particular blog, but it was how we apply the assume breach there, and it's a good read on that. And again, there's that download link for that poster for the AKAMS Secure Customer. And so the overview of the course itself, I've just completed the introduction overview. The next module, Tim is going to be covering the Microsoft role as a cloud provider and that trusted cloud provider piece. And then the next piece that we'll get into after that is the strategy, governance, and operationalization. That's sort of setting the tone for this new world where we have these things all crashing into each other and all the challenges with that. The next piece down being the administrative control and how to make sure that you maintain control of your cloud services and, to a degree, your on-premise assets. Your information and data security, and how do you look at that? What are the ways to help guide and make sure that the investments you make in that space are effective? And we learned some lessons from what's been attempted in the past. User and device security, because as you mentioned, it's sort of the forgotten part of the cloud. We want to make sure that those user accounts and those devices are as secure as they absolutely can be. And then the last piece is a little bit more focused on the on-premise side, and some of it's cloud applicable as well. But we're going to talk about those key points around application security, whether you buy it or you write it, the network security, and kind of what are the imperatives, and where does network security fit in this world. We've talked about how it's been diminished. Well, what is its role in this new world? And then the operating system management middleware that, if I have an OS stack to secure, such as on IaaS or in the Fabric, how do I do that? And then the Fabric and physical security in the event of that you're running a private cloud. What are the things that you should be worrying about in this new world? And then, of course, a summary to wrap it up. Any final comments? Or?
No, I think it's a great course. I know there's a lot of the IT pros that I talk to around the world, a lot of the security professionals that will be interested in the content. And so I'm looking forward to getting to the next module.
Yep. And so last piece here we want to cover is just those key takeaways that the cloud and cybersecurity threats are forcing us to think differently, and this course is really setting that direction and approaching this new world. And don't be afraid to question what has and hasn't worked in the past. And embrace once you have a trustworthy cloud provider, you can embrace the cloud as a way to really get your IT security more aligned with the business. And then, of course, if anybody that's been in IT has heard this for the longest time, but people, process, and technology are critical to success. And it's not something where you magically put in one technology product and everything works well. It really is something that has to incorporate people, process, technology, especially because the adversaries are getting really good at exploiting our habits and our people. And so,
Yeah, what I'll add, Mark, is that for a lot of the organizations I know that move some of their operations into a cloud service provider, the unexpected thing for them is usually the process. So you're not just taking your processes that you've been doing on premise for many years or whatever, and doing the same thing, but now it's in the cloud. The cloud will be a catalyst for change, not just you're now running servers in someone else's data center. This, for many of the customers I talk to, the process changes are the things that they weren't aware of. And so, I mean, you make a great point around process. Processes will change when you move to the cloud.
Yep, for sure. And of course, it's all about the data. We'll see you in the next module.